Hi, everyone, and welcome to Juno Sphere, where we learn about a whole sphere of topics and how they are interconnected, just as we are all interconnected. The purpose of this video is to enlighten and entertain you. In this video, Juno seeks to peel back the layers of misconceptions throughout the ages about witches in an effort to set the record straight. Stay tuned to the end for a little bit of witchy humor. For starters, the actual meaning of the word witch is linked to wisdom and is the same root as to have wit and to know. It comes from the Anglo-Saxon Wicca, spelled W-I-C-C-E for female or W-I-C-C-A for male, meaning wise one, witches being both female and male. Now let's look at their appearance. It was generally agreed that any woman with dissimilar eyes was a witch. Where most people had dark eyes and swarthy complexions, as in Spain and Italy, pale blue eyes were associated with witchcraft. Many claimed any woman with red hair was a witch. This may have been because red-haired people are usually freckled, and freckles were often identified as witch marks, as were moles, warts, birthmarks, pimples, pockmarks, cysts, liver spots, wens, or any other blemish. Some witch finders said that mark could resemble an insect bite or an ulcer. No one ever explained how the witch mark differed from an ordinary blemish. Since few bodies were unblemished, the search for the mark seldom failed. Witches were often characterized as seductresses or cannibals, or depicted as owls, cats, and toads, in the belief that they could physically transform themselves into these creatures of the night. We are all familiar with the horrible ingredients associated with a witch's potion. Shakespeare made famous such phrases as toe of frog and eye of newt. But these ingredients aren't as literal or as disgusting as they seem. In the Middle Ages, only monks and scholars knew the Latin names for plants. Commoners would have their own names for the plants they used in everyday cooking and medicine. Such common names often came about in response to the look of the plant's leaves or petals, or as a way of describing the plant's healing properties. So when the witches in Macbeth spoke of eye of newt, they were most likely referring to wild mustard seed. Toe of frog referred to the bulbous buttercup, while wool of bat meant simply moss. If lion's tooth turned up in anything, then it was probably dandelion, and bird's foot was fenugreek. The suggestion that witches were able to fly might have come from the fact that mandrake root and other hallucinogenic plants were used in witchcraft ceremonies. Users described the hallucinogenic and euphoric properties of the plants as making them feel as if they were floating. There has also been some controversy over which way around a witch is supposed to sit on a broomstick. Most people imagine that the bristles will be at the rear. Certainly, that's how it appeared in popular culture over the years. One woodcut from Germany in 1712 shows 4 broomsticks being ridden, 2 with bristles at the back and 2 with bristles at the front. However, the same picture also shows witches riding pitchforks and a rake, suggesting that the preferred mode of transport for the historical witch remains an unresolved issue. Any unusual ability in a woman instantly raised a charge of witchcraft. The so-called Witch of Newbury was murdered by a group of soldiers because she knew how to go surfing on the river. Soldiers of the Earl of Essex saw her doing it and were as much astonished as they could be. Most of the soldiers were afraid to touch her, but a few brave souls ambushed the board rider as she came to shore, slashed her head, beat her, and shot her, leaving her detested carcass to the worms. Witches were convenient scapegoats for doctors who failed to cure their patients, for it was the received belief that witch-caused illnesses were incurable. Wyer said, "Ignorant and clumsy physicians blame all sicknesses which they are unable to cure, of which they have treated wrongly, on witchery." The fate of a witch might be directly proportional to her fortune. The Pope made saints out of rich witches, but poor witches were burned. Among many examples tending to support this opinion was the famous French Chambre Ardente affair, which involved many members of the aristocracy and the upper-class clergy in a witch cult. Numerous male and female servants were tortured and burned for assisting their masters in working witchcraft. But in all the 4 years the affair dragged on, no noble person was tortured or executed. Illogically enough, the authorities persecuted poor outcast folk as witches, yet professed to believe witches could provide themselves with all the wealth anyone could want. Reginald Scott, a disbeliever, scornfully observed that witches were said to transfer their neighbor's corn into their own ground, and yet are perpetual beggars, and cannot enrich themselves, either with money or otherwise. Accusing a widow of being a witch was also a convenient way of acquiring her valuable property. Yet another example of the patriarchy using their power to further subjugate women. Even during the most famous of witch trials in Salem, Massachusetts, the men were not exempt from suspicion. Between February 1692 and May 1693, 200 people in Salem were accused. In the end, only 19 were found guilty, 14 women and 5 men. Contrary to popular belief, no witches were burned at the stake in America. They were hanged, with the exception of Giles Corey, who was crushed to death under stones. In yet another ironic twist, even though the majority of people accused of being witches were women, it is a man, Giles Corey, who is most often remembered for being brought to trial. He wasn't found guilty of being a witch. In fact, he didn't enter a plea at all, which was what led to his inadvertent execution through pressing. Confessing to being a witch himself would have had the result of his property not going to his heirs. Giles Corey knew that according to English law, refusing to plead whether innocent or guilty would stall the legal procedure. If he never entered a plea, the authorities would be unable to confiscate his property and assets, which would instead be inherited by his heirs as normal. Pressing occurred only once in American history. Giles Corey is the only victim to date. Technically, it was illegal under law established in England in 16 41. The procedure should not have been administered to Corey. As each weight was added, the victim was asked if he would now like to plead. Giles Corey's only response during the process, and his last words, were the demand, "More weight!" He survived this brutal torture for 3 days before he died. It just goes to show that when the witch finder came to town, nobody was safe. Being a man or even a Puritan minister could not save you. In Europe, women were not the only ones accused of being witches either. During the 16th and 17th centuries in Europe, an estimated 60,000 men and women were put to death based on accusations of witchcraft. In England alone, during the Elizabethan era, 1558 to 1603, 270 witchcraft trials were held. There were 247 women and 23 men who were accused and brought to trial. Although we consider the standard punishment for witchcraft to be burnt at the stake, in fact, witches were generally hanged. Burning was more of a French punishment, as illustrated by the case of Joan of Arc. The Witchcraft Act of 1735 was still being used in 1944. In 1735, the Witchcraft Act was passed in Britain. This legislation made it a crime for a person to claim that any other person had magical powers or was practicing witchcraft. Before it became law, previous witchcraft legislation had worked on the assumption that magic and witchcraft genuinely existed. However, with its new wording, the Witchcraft Act of 1735 stated that it was not witchcraft per se that was against the law. Instead, the crime was holding the superstitious belief that witches existed. The act reflected the changing beliefs in Europe and effectively brought an end to witch hunting in England. However, the Witchcraft Act of 1735 remained active in Britain for many years, right up until the middle of the 20th century. In 1944, Jane Rebecca York became the last person to be tried under it. She wasn't actually accused of being a witch, but of being a medium. She was convicted of pretending to cause the spirits of deceased persons to be present. Hopefully, the information presented here puts to rest some common misconceptions about witches. Do you know of any others that are not covered in this video? Please leave your thoughts in the comments below. For more information on a variety of topics, ranging from superstitions to the healing arts, please check out the growing library of videos on Junosphere. Please like, subscribe, comment, and share, and jingle that bell to receive notifications. I'm so appreciative of your support. Thanks for tuning in, and I invite you to tune in to Junosphere again soon. Bye.